My name's David Heath, and I've decided to take a bit of time out from my own online learning to explain a bit about what Learnline is, so that you have a good idea of what you'll be using it for and what you won't be using it for. So I've come to one of Australia's glorious and, unfortunately for today, windy farming areas where we have lots of cattle and wheat being produced. And I thought this was a good place to start the video because, although it's very windy, one of the great things about Learnline and about online managed learning systems is that they allow students to do a lot of their study from wherever environment they happen to be, as long as they've got some kind of internet-enabled device, like this iPad or your laptop, or even a phone, depending on what it is that you'll be doing. There's really three things that you can think about as being those main activities that you'll be doing whenever you're using the online learning system. So we're going to talk about three main things, and those things are accessing and engaging with learning materials. So that's one of the first things that you'll do when you get access to the online learning system. One of the other things that the online learning system is great for is communicating with other students and your lecturer. So you don't need to be in the same state, you don't need to be in the same town, you don't even need to be in the same country to communicate effectively with your lecturer and your students. And the last thing that you'll probably be doing whenever you're using Learnline, so one of the three things, the last one is submitting and receiving feedback on your assessments. So I thought it best to actually get out of the wind so that I can talk a little bit more about the first point that I made a couple of minutes ago, and that's accessing and engaging with learning materials. So that's really one of the core and most useful functions that you'll probably find when you're using Learnline. Now, the reason that accessing and engaging in learning materials is such a big part of Learnline is because if you think back to what studying might have been like 10 or 15 years ago, you had to wait for materials in the post. You had to, if you changed the subject, you would have to wait for the materials. You'd have to send some back, and then you'd have to wait for a new lot of materials to come. It also meant that you had to spend money on photocopying. You also had to buy textbooks for every unit that you did. And if you had to do any journal searching or any kind of readings, you'd have to go to the library and get them. One of the great things about online learning is that it actually allows lecturers to provide resources to students in a much easier to access way. And so that's something that you should be really positive about when you're using Learnline. It means that you might be able to do things like access copies of lecture materials as well. You might even be able to get videos and audio recordings that have been made by the lecturer. So there's a lot of different ways in which Learnline allows you to access and engage with your learning materials. So it'll depend a little bit on what you're studying, what types of resources that will be used. And you'll still probably find that for some of your units you may have to purchase a set textbook or go to the library and photocopy a particular reading. But in the main, there's a lot more resources that are directly available to students using Learnline than there were in the past. So I thought for this part where we're going to be talking about our second main thing that you'll be doing in Learnline, which is communicating with other students and your lecturer. I thought for this video I found the humble telephone box and the good old post box, which hopefully you won't have to use as much if you're using Learnline, because there's a range of different communication tools that Learnline has available that allow you to do a whole range of different things, including social and academic things. So when we talk about communication tools and the types of things that you'll be doing, it's important to note that there's a few different types of tools and they allow you to do different things. And I'll just mention them here, but we'll talk a bit more about them in module 3 and 4 of this unit. So one of the first things to note is you have asynchronous communication tools and synchronous communication tools. So synchronous communication tools mean that yourself and your fellow students and your lecturer, for example, might all need to be online at the same time, and you might meet in one space where you all talk at the same time. So we have the online classroom, which is the most used example of that. Your asynchronous communication tools mean that you don't necessarily have to be all online at the same time. So you might write something on a discussion board one evening, and then you'll find that in the morning some of your colleagues respond from your class. So that's a really interesting thing to note, asynchronous and synchronous communication. It's also important to note that communication is one of the areas in which mobile compatibility is at its strongest with Learnline. So things like the discussion board and the online classroom can be used with your mobile devices. One of the other key points about our communication tools is that some of them are specifically focused on social communication and others are more focused on academic communication. So the social communication tools are typically accessed from the top right-hand corner of Learnline and are things like people, spaces, messages and things like that. And your more formal academic communication tools like the discussion board, the journal and the blog that you might, or quite often you might be graded on, are those ones which you'll often find links to in your learning materials or embedded within the unit. One of the key things I think about Learnline's communication tools is it allows internal and external students to get to know each other, which is a really positive thing. In the past, there wasn't a whole lot of dialogue between the two, but in reality, you're all studying the same material, so it can mean that you have a greater group of students to find people in common with and also to share different ideas with. So that's about it for our communication tools. Next up, we're going to have a look at the third main thing that you'll be doing in Learnline. So we've already talked about accessing and engaging with learning materials, something that you'll do a lot of the time, communicating with other students and your lecturer. That's another key thing you'll be doing. And the last one is submitting assessments and accessing your feedback on those assessments. So the third main thing that you'll be doing when you're working in Learnline is submitting your assessment items and receiving feedback on those items. So it's a really important thing for most students to find out what it is that they have to do in their units to succeed and make sure that they pass their unit and hopefully do even better than that. So there's a few different ways in which you can submit work to your lecturer. Sometimes you might record a presentation. In other instances, they might be assessing the discussion board. You also have things like assignment submission points, which are for written assignments like essays and reports. And you also have things like online tests. So online tests are different, where you get different questions and you get into Learnline and you log in and you go through the test, and there'll be a range of different conditions that are in place, such as a number of questions, a time limit, whether you can save the test and come back later and things like that. So Learnline has a lot of flexibility about assessment, and more than likely you will come across a few different ways of being assessed during your studies. There's also ways in which you can access your feedback. So you don't have to go to the post office and get your assignment in the mail. You can access the Grade Centre, or what's sometimes known as the My Grades area, and see as soon as your lecturer has uploaded and okayed your feedback, you'll receive it in the My Grades area. So assessment and feedback are really important parts of what you'll be doing when you're working in Learnline. Although this online learning system has a lot of different possibilities, more than likely what you'll be doing at any given time. So if you're in Learnline, more than likely you'll either be looking for readings and resources and accessing your learning materials, or talking to your students, whether it's through writing or whether it's through an online classroom, or be submitting your assignments and accessing feedback. That's almost exclusively what Learnline's used for,